The wind was a blade against Clara Rollins' face, sharp and cold enough to steal the breath from her lungs. It whipped her black mourning dress against her legs as she pushed the last shovelful of frozen earth onto the mound. The ground was stubborn, fighting the shovel with every push, just as it had fought to take her husband. Now it had him. James was gone, buried beneath a thin blanket of dirt that would soon be covered in snow. She stood alone at the crude grave, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving Wyoming sky. The few townspeople from Sage Hollow who had bothered to watch the burial had already retreated to the warmth of their homes, their duty done. Clara felt nothing but a hollow ache where her heart used to be. She and James had come west with dreams of a life built with their own hands, a life of freedom and promise. They had poured every cent and every drop of sweat into their small homestead. He had died defending it in a spray of gunfire that still echoed in her nightmares. Now she was a widow at 24 with no money, no family, and no one to turn to. The next day brought the banker, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, whose sympathy was as thin as the winter sun. The loan for the land was in James's name. With him gone, and no means to make the payment, the bank had no choice but to reclaim the property. He gave her 1 week. Desperation became Clara's constant companion. She tried to sell their meager possessions, but the neighbors came not to buy, but to stare. The whispers followed her like a shadow. Cursed. That was the word they used. She was the widow of a troublemaker, a woman touched by violence and death. No one wanted any part of it. Day after day, she faced rejection. The doors of the small community were closed to her, locked tight by suspicion and fear. Her savings dwindled to a few pennies. Hunger became a dull, constant ache. It was on her last day, as the sun began to set, that Silas Croft approached her. He was the wealthiest man in the county, a rancher with a sprawling empire and a reputation for getting whatever he wanted. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his belly straining against the buttons of his fine wool coat. "Mrs. Rollins," he said, his voice smooth and low, "a woman like you shouldn't be left to fend for herself. I can offer you a solution. I have a large house, plenty of work for a woman's hands. You would have a roof over your head, food in your belly, protection." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and ugly. Protection. He wasn't offering a job. He was offering a gilded cage. She would be his property, expected to warm his bed and submit to his whims in exchange for survival. Clara looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze clear and cold as ice. "I am not for sale, Mr. Croft." His smile faltered, replaced by irritation. "Think on it. When you're starving in a ditch, my offer might look a lot better." That night she made her decision. If the world of men and towns had cast her out, she would seek her chances elsewhere. The mountains loomed to the west, wild and dangerous, home to wolves and winter storms. But they were also a place of solitude, a place where the whispers of Sage Hollow could not reach her. She packed what little she had left, a thick wool blanket, dried beans, a tin cup, and James's revolver. The cold peacemaker was heavy in her hand. James had taught her how to shoot, and now it felt like the only friend she had left. She saddled her horse, Daisy, a gentle mare with a coat the color of honey, and rode away without looking back. The first day of travel was bearable, but as she climbed higher, the landscape grew more rugged. By the second afternoon, the sky had turned a leaden gray. The first flakes began to fall, soft at first, then harder, thicker, driven by a rising wind. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The snow came down in a blinding sheet, erasing the trail, the trees, the very shape of the land. Daisy whinnied in fear, stumbling on the uneven ground. Clara could no longer feel her fingers or her toes. The cold was seeping into her bones. She fell once, then twice. The thought was tempting to simply lie down and let the cold take her. But the image of James's face flashed in her mind. She could not give up. She pushed herself to her feet one last time, taking a few more stumbling steps before her legs finally gave out. She collapsed into a snowdrift, the world spinning. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was the vague dark shape of something man-made through the blizzard. A structure, a cabin perhaps. Then there was only the cold and the silence. Warmth was the first thing she registered. A deep penetrating warmth that seemed to be pulling her back from a great cold distance. Then came the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. Clara's eyelids fluttered open. She was lying on a pallet of straw and furs near a large stone fireplace. The room was small, the walls built of rough-hewn logs. Her gaze traveled to the figure sitting in one of the chairs by the fire, a man. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and worn denim. His hair was dark and shaggy. He seemed perfectly still, a part of the quiet, rustic cabin itself. A small cough escaped her lips. The man turned his head slowly. His face was all angles and shadows in the firelight. A hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with a dark, untrimmed beard. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, startling blue, and they watched her with an unnerving intensity, guarded and unreadable. He rose from his chair, tall, taller than James had been, and moved with quiet, deliberate grace. He walked to the hearth, ladled broth from a pot into a wooden bowl, and brought it to her. "Drink," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. She took the bowl with trembling hands and drank greedily. It was hot and salty, with the rich taste of venison, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. When she finished, he took the empty bowl and returned to his chair. The silence stretched between them. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice raspy. "My cabin," he answered, not looking at her. "Who are you?" He hesitated. "Eli Carver. You found me. Found your horse first. You were half buried in the snow. Lucky I was checking my trap lines." He spoke in short, clipped sentences, offering no more information than necessary. "The storm's not letting up," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Could last for days. You can stay until you're well enough to ride." It was not an invitation, but a simple statement of fact. Clara lay back down, her head spinning. She was alive. She was warm. But she was not safe. She was trapped by the blizzard in a remote cabin with a hard, silent stranger whose past was a complete mystery. The days that followed bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the cabin's single grimy window. Outside, the world remained a maelstrom of white. For Clara, it was a slow return to life. Eli remained a ghost in his own home. Each morning before the sun had fully risen, he would stoke the fire, leave food for her, and disappear into the white wilderness for hours, returning with rabbits or grouse slung over his shoulder. He avoided her eyes. When she spoke, offering quiet thanks, he would give a short, sharp nod, his gaze fixed anywhere but her face. The emotional distance he kept was as vast and cold as the snow-covered mountains. Yet his actions contradicted his demeanor. He made sure she was warm, fed, and had water. He had cleaned and oiled her husband's revolver and placed it on the small crate beside her pallet, a gesture she couldn't decipher. As her strength returned, Clara could no longer bear the helplessness. She began to move about the small cabin. She swept the floor, washed dishes, stewed the rabbits he brought back. Eli accepted her contributions with the same stoic silence, but she noticed he ate every last bite. One evening, driven by knowing curiosity, she found a worn, leather-bound journal on a small shelf above his bedroll. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with a jagged, forceful script, not a diary of daily events, but a chaotic collection of thoughts and drawings, maps of canyons, sketches that looked like battlefields, the layout of a dusty street with X's marking positions. Then she found the list, a dozen names, each with a date, and through every single name, a thick, dark line had been drawn, crossing them out with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. These were not debts paid. This was a ledger of death. Her suspicion hardened into near certainty. Eli Carver was, or had been, a gunslinger, a man who lived by the revolver. She closed the journal and quickly put it back just as she heard his boots crunching in the snow outside. A new kind of tension began to grow in the cabin. It was an awareness of each other that was both awkward and intensely charged. Clara found herself watching him, the way he cleaned his rifle, the fluid strength in his shoulders. And sometimes, when she was stirring the stew, she would feel the weight of his gaze on her. One afternoon, the steady thud of his axe splitting firewood suddenly stopped, followed by a sharp, guttural curse. Clara rushed to the door. Eli was standing with his back to her, staring at his left hand. A dark line of red was welling up, dripping onto the pristine snow. "Let me see," she said firmly. "It's nothing. It is not nothing." She took his large, calloused hand in her own. The cut was deep, a nasty gash across his palm. "Come inside," she ordered. He followed reluctantly. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound. His hand was rough and scarred, a map of a hard-lived life. As she worked, she could feel the tension in him, the tight control he held over himself. She wrapped the linen tightly around his palm. When she finished, her fingers lingered for a second too long on his wrist. She looked up, and for the first time, he did not look away. His pale blue eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of raw, aching vulnerability, as if the wound in his hand had opened a crack in the armor around his soul. The moment stretched, fragile and unspoken. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask slammed back into place. He pulled his hand away and turned his back to her. Days passed. The argument, when it finally came, erupted out of the strained silence. "Why are you hiding up here?" she asked abruptly. Eli was sharpening a skinning knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "Not hiding, living. I saw your journal, Eli." The scraping stopped. He set the knife down with slow, deliberate care. "You had no right. And you had no right to leave me wondering if the man who saved my life might also be the man who ends it." He finally turned to face her, his eyes blazing with cold fire. "If I wanted you dead, woman, you would have been dead in the snow." "Then who are those men on your list? What did you do?" His face hardened into a mask of stone. "That is my business. It has nothing to do with you." "My safe little life?" Tears of anger welled in her eyes. "My husband was shot down in the dirt over a piece of land. I buried him myself. I was cast out by my town and left to starve. Do not dare speak to me of what I know." His anger seemed to drain away. He looked away, his jaw tight. "Yes," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "It can." A fragile truce settled between them in the days after. They began to work together in comfortable, silent rhythm, repairing the cabin, mixing mud and dried grass to patch the chinking between logs. One evening, as darkness fell, a long, mournful howl pierced the steady moan of the wind. A wolf. The sound was primal, lonely, and filled with wild hunger. Terror shot through Clara. The wolf howled again, sounding as if it were right outside the cabin wall. All the loss, the fear, the desperation of the past weeks coalesced into a single, overwhelming feeling of being utterly alone and vulnerable. She looked at Eli, a formidable silhouette against the flickering flames. He was a man of violence and secrets, but in that moment, he was also strength. He was a wall against a terrifying darkness. Slowly, trembling, she stood up from her pallet. She crossed the small space and, without a word, slipped into his bedroll beside him. Eli froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He just sat there, staring into the fire, as if he had been turned to stone. The wolf howled again. She pressed closer to the warmth of his body, and her voice was a ragged whisper. "Don't stop. I need this." He did not answer. After a long moment, he slowly set his pistol down. He shifted his weight and lay down beside her, his back to her at first. Then, as another howl ripped through the night, she felt his arm reach back, pulling her against him. He held her, his large, warm body a solid shield against the cold and the fear. That night changed everything. Over the following weeks, as winter tightened its grip, they fell into a routine as natural as breathing. He would chop wood, hunt, and trap. She would prepare meals, haul water, tend to their small world. They moved around each other with quiet, practiced grace. One day, when the sky cleared to a brilliant blue, Eli announced he was going to fish. Clara insisted on coming. They sat on a fallen log, their lines dangling in icy water. After a long silence, she felt a tug and pulled up a small silver fish. A laugh escaped her, genuine, unrestrained, the first since before James's death. Eli stared at her, and then she saw it. The corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "What was your life like before this?" she asked softly. He grew still, his gaze turning distant. "I was a different man." That night, huddled by the fire, she told him the truth about James. "It wasn't just a land dispute," she said quietly. "Silas Croft wanted our land. He had a good stream. James was going to expose him to the marshal. The next day, Croft's men came. They murdered him." Her voice cracked. "I was inside. I heard the shots. By the time I got to him, he was gone. And all I can think is, why him? Why not me? I survived, and I feel like a coward for it." Eli's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes held deep, profound sorrow. He let the silence sit before he spoke, his voice a low rumble. Guilt is a heavier burden than a coffin. Then he told her his story. He had been a hired gun. In Kansas, during a dispute, a crossfire erupted. A stray bullet killed a little girl playing on the boardwalk. "I swore that day I would never draw my gun for money again. But that didn't stop the killing. The men I worked for put a price on my head, blamed me for things I didn't do to ensure I would never talk." His voice broke. "So I came here, to these mountains, to disappear, to let Eli Carver die. Two different kinds of loss, two different burdens of guilt, two sides of the same violent coin. The storm hit that night with savage fury. A massive gust tore the wooden door from its hinges. Snow and ice poured in, extinguishing the candle and threatening the fire. With a deafening crash, the top of the chimney collapsed, smothering the flames. Their fire, their only source of heat, was gone. Eli grabbed the chairs and smashed them for fuel, building a small, desperate fire on the floor. They burned the furniture, wrapped in every blanket they possessed. The cold was relentless. Huddled in near darkness, Clara placed her hand on his arm. "I'm not afraid of your past, Eli. I'm not afraid of you." The cold was seeping deeper. Their time was running out. "Hold me," she whispered. "Please hold me." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He gathered her into his arms, pulling their shared blankets around them. In the heart of the storm, beside a dying fire, they came together. It was not gentle or romantic. It was slow, aching, and raw. A collision of two wounded souls reaching for something warm in a world that had grown impossibly cold. Spring came in whispers. Dripping icicles, the smell of damp earth, the murmur of the creek throwing off its shackles of ice. Their world expanded with the receding snow. They gathered wild onions and fiddlehead ferns, repaired the cabin's roof, worked side by side with a new ease between them. The intrusion came without warning. An old trapper named Jebediah emerged from the trees. He talked for an hour about news from the world they'd left behind. Then, as he was leaving, his eyes fixed on Eli's face with dawning recognition. "I know you," he rasped. "Your picture is up in a dozen marshals' offices. They called you Black Carver. $2,500. The clearing went utterly still. Eli's voice was a chilling whisper, colder than any winter wind. "You didn't see anyone here today, old man. If I ever hear you spoke a word of this, I will hunt you down." The trapper fled in terror. The peace was shattered. Black Carver, a bounty. What does it mean? Clara demanded. Eli finally told her the full truth. The girl killed in Kansas, it was his younger brother Samuel who fired the shot. He was just a boy, barely 18. I brought him into that life. He had a wife, a baby on the way. I took the blame so he could live. An overwhelming wave of love washed over Clara. He wasn't a monster. He was the most honorable man she'd ever known. We have to leave, she said urgently. We can go west, start over, together. He slowly removed her hand from his arm. There is no new life for me, Clara. That name, that bounty, it's a shadow that follows wherever I go. The argument was bitter. She pleaded, reasoned, begged. He countered with cold realism. Finally, she stood before him, trembling. I love you, Eli. He saw the turmoil in his eyes, but he did not speak the words back. He simply turned away. That night, Clara made a decision. If he wouldn't save himself, she would do it for him. Before dawn, she slipped out, saddled Daisy, and rode towards Sage Hollow. She would expose Silas Croft, make a deal with the law. She was halfway to the plains when 3 men stepped onto the trail. Croft's men, the same ones who'd killed James. The little widow decided to come down from the mountain. The leader sneered. Mr. Croft said you might be a loose end that needed tying up. Clara pulled her revolver and fired, hitting one man in the shoulder. But another grabbed her from behind, tore the gun away. The scarred man's fist came out of nowhere. Blinding pain, then blackness. Miles away, Eli woke to find Clara gone. Her tracks led down the mountain. Then he saw it, Daisy, wandering riderless. The quiet man who had sought to bury himself in the mountains died in that instant. Rage, pure and black, boiled up from the depths of his soul. He was no longer a ghost. He was a Black Carver, and he was going hunting. He found them in a small clearing. Clara was bound, bruised. The man she'd shot was propped against a tree, pale. The others were arguing about what to do next. We finish it here, the scarred man said, drawing his pistol. Eli didn't call out. He raised his rifle. The world narrowed. He squeezed the trigger. The scarred man pitched forward. The second man spun, his pistol clearing its holster. 2 shots rang out. The man collapsed. Eli stood over the last wounded man. Who sent you? Silas Croft. Please don't kill me. Eli holstered his pistol. Get on your horse. Tell Croft that Clara Rollins is under my protection. If he comes near her again, I will burn his ranch to the ground with him inside it. The man fled. Eli cut Clara's bonds. Then a wave of dizziness hit him. He looked down, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He'd been hit. He sank to his knees, the world tilting. The last thing he saw was Clara's face, her eyes wide with fierce determination. Clara had never known she possessed such strength. Getting Eli onto his horse was a monumental struggle, but she did it. She led both horses up the mountain, watching the stain spread, listening to him mutter names from his past. She pushed through exhaustion and terror until they reached the cabin. For days she fought for his life, cleaning the wound, fighting infection, keeping the fire going, forcing broth between his lips. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. He awoke to find her asleep in a chair beside him, her face etched with exhaustion. He watched her for a long time, a feeling so powerful rising in his chest it almost choked him. She stirred, her eyes opening. They lit up when she saw him awake. You came for me, she whispered. He looked at her, letting her see all the way into his soul. I always would. When he was strong enough to ride, they knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The trapper knew. Croftsy, wounded man knew. We could still run, Clara said, though her voice lacked conviction. Eli took her hand. Running is what almost got you killed. I've been running for 10 years. It stops now. We go back together. They rode into Sage Hollow in broad daylight, their heads held high. They walked into the sheriff's office. "I am here to report the murder of my husband, James Rollins, by men in the employ of Silas Croft," Clara said clearly. Sheriff Miller listened uncomfortably. "Those are serious accusations. You have no proof." "I am her proof," Eli said quietly. He unbuckled his gun belt and placed it on the desk. "I am wanted. There's a bounty on my head. The name is Black Carver." The sheriff's jaw dropped. "The murders I'm wanted for were committed by men working for people like Silas Croft," Eli continued. "I took the blame to protect my brother. I've been silent for 10 years. I will be silent no longer." The town was torn. Some scoffed, but others, the small ranchers bullied by Croft for years, began to look at Clara and Eli with quiet admiration. The next day, Croft's wounded man rode into town and sat on his horse, staring at Clara's window. A silent threat. When the sheriff refused to act, the town began to turn. The blacksmith appeared on the street with a rifle. 2 farmers took positions at the other end. Mr. Gable cleaned a shotgun on his porch. The decent folk were quietly choosing their side. The final confrontation came at dusk. 6 riders appeared, Croft's death squad. They dismounted near the livery, intending to circle around to the hotel. A lamp flared in the blacksmith's forge. "This is as far as you go," Peterson said, rifle in hand. From the hotel window, Eli's rifle cracked. 1 rider fell. Gunfire exploded. The peaceful evening shattered. Eli worked with cold precision. Clara loaded rifles beside him, passing him weapons with trembling but steady hands. Below, the street had become a battlefield. Mr. Gable's wife fired from a doorway. The blacksmith held his position. The tide turned. The remaining gunmen knew they were beaten. Then the leader rose from behind cover, his pistol aimed not at the rooftops, but at Clara in the window. Eli saw it. He shoved Clara to the floor as a deafening roar filled the room. A brutal force slammed into his chest, throwing him back against the wall. He'd been shot. Clara screamed, scrambling to his side. Another shot rang out. The gunman fell. The last of Croft's men fled. The fight was over. But Clara's world had shrunk to the man lying against the wall, a terrible stain spreading across his chest. "Eli, look at me," she choked out, pressing her hands to the wound. His pale eyes found hers, clouded with pain. "You're safe," he whispered. "No," she sobbed. "You don't get to save me and then leave me." She leaned close, tears falling onto his face. The memory of that first night in the cabin rose up, her desperate plea. "Don't stop," she cried. "Don't stop breathing. Don't stop fighting. I need you." He didn't die. The town doctor declared the bullet had missed his heart by a miracle's inch. Clara didn't leave his bedside for a week. The town rallied around them, bringing food and linens. Silas Croft disappeared, his power broken. Weeks later, when Eli could walk, they returned to the mountains. Together, they rebuilt the cabin. It was slow, hard work, but they worked in comfortable silence, their movements a practiced dance of partnership. The cabin that rose was stronger than before, no longer a refuge for a ghost, but a home built with their own hands. They began splitting their time between the cabin and town. Clara turned the abandoned land office into a schoolhouse. Eli opened a small livery, training horses with quiet patience. Their love, born in desperation and forged in conflict, settled into something deep and enduring, a quiet, steady flame. One evening, years later, they sat in their rebuilt cabin as the first snow of the season fell. Eli sat in a chair he'd built himself. Clara sat on the floor, her back against his legs, her head on his knee. He stroked her hair. The snow fell, muffling the world, creating perfect silence. They didn't need to speak. The silence was no longer empty or haunted. It was full of everything they had overcome. The grief, the fear, the violence, the fight for their lives. It was full of the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of their 2 hearts, finally, truly at home.